Imagine this scene: a black night sky, a burning house, the deafening sounds of sirens. Inside, there is smoke, heat, and only one man dares to enter where others dare not. Lewis, a black firefighter, knows that a life is at stake. In the puffs of thick smoke, he finds a little girl, frightened, weakened. He picks her up and carries her outside just as the fire reaches the door. Heart sinking, the crowd sighs in relief, but then the police show up. Before he can explain himself, Lewis finds himself in handcuffs. As if in the eyes of the police, he is an enemy. Why does the hero who risked everything suddenly become a suspect? Why does prejudice overshadow the deed? Friends, if you are watching this video, write in the comments where you are from. It's very important for us to know who you are and how you support us. You help promote our channel and inspire us to tell the truth, to share stories that everyone can hear. Every message you send, every word you say is the power that makes us fight for justice together. You are really important to us. Enjoy the show. Lewis Woods was born and raised in a poor neighborhood where every day was a struggle. Even from a young age, he realized that the world he was to live in would not be like most. The color of his skin had always attracted unnecessary stares and harsh judgments. But Lewis wasn't going to live in the shadow of prejudice. Strong and determined, he chose to become a firefighter, a job that values courage, dedication, and loyalty. Being a black firefighter in a big city proved more difficult than Lewis expected. When he first began his career, many of his colleagues, especially the older and more experienced ones, were slow to trust him. Teasing, suspicious glances, and covert, sometimes overt, hostility became his daily reality. He always seemed to have to work twice as hard to earn even a fraction of the respect his colleagues received by default. But Lewis was undeterred. He wanted to be the best in his profession, even if the world was against him. Difficult training, rigorous routines, and risking his life did not scare him. He was willing to work through the night, leaving behind the biases and humiliations that were woven into his workday. He saw each tour of duty as a new chance to prove above all to himself that he was worthy of the uniform and the respect it symbolized. The night on duty was quiet. The city had fallen into silence, diluted only by the measured sound of instruments and the slight rustle of radios in the control room. Lewis had been on duty for several hours and, as if by inertia, was replaying in his head the events of the last few weeks. Several difficult calls, sleepless nights, and always a shadow of resentment from some of his coworkers. He was used to not showing it, but inside, every grain of distrust and disrespect hurt him deeper than the fire he was fighting. The hidden barriers Lewis encountered along the way were no obstacle to his determination. He knew that it could be a symbol of strength and overcoming difficulties for someone. And on this night, as always, he was ready for any challenge. The night is shattered by the deafening sound of a siren, bringing Lewis out of his reverie. The alarm comes suddenly, but for firefighters, it's a call to action that can't be ignored for a moment. Lewis, as if on a roll, rushes to the equipment he could handle with his eyes closed. This time, however, something awaits him that will make his heart quicken its rhythm. On the walkie-talkie, a broken voice gives details. An apartment building on the outskirts of the city has caught fire. A strong fire. Smoke has spread throughout the building. Residents are evacuating in panic, but most importantly in one of the apartments. According to neighbors, a little girl was left behind. The child was trapped, surrounded by flames, without a single chance to get out on her own. Lewis's fingers instantly clenched on the straps of his gear, his heart thudding in his ears. Every word that came over the ear was like a spear piercing his inner armor. Thoughts of danger, of the gravity of the night's challenge, all of it faded before the terrible picture he drew in his mind. A tiny figure surrounded by unbearable heat and smoke, alone and frightened, waiting for a miracle. He knew he had no right to fail. A sense of responsibility swept over him in a wave. No matter how great the threat, no matter the pressure of the thought of walking toward the flames, he could not let fear or doubt stop him. He had not just a job in front of him, not just a rescue mission, but a human life. Lewis felt a heavy weight building in his chest, but it wasn't a weight of fear. It was a weight of determination. A little girl on fire was not something he could ever ignore. The words stranger or own were meaningless when it came to a child whose life he was willing to fight for to the end. Lewis gripped his helmet tightly and checked every fastener on his gear, feeling the same fire in his chest. that gave him the strength to go forward, even when his mind screamed danger. He knew exactly what awaited him inside: unbearable heat, unrelenting smoke, impenetrable darkness. The fire did no favors. It cared neither for courage nor humanity. It devoured everything in its path. As soon as Lewis entered the building, the heat came at him from all sides, like invisible walls ready to crush him under their pressure. Smoke clogged every crevice. His ears ached from the crackling of the glowing beams. But inside, Lewis was utterly silent. He suppressed every hint of fear, every call of instinct that demanded his stop and protect himself. Every experience he'd had, every risky move he'd made in the past had led him to this moment when he had to be at his limit for the life of another. The thick puffs of smoke made it difficult to breathe, even with the oxygen mask on, and the flames flaring at every step tried to drown out his resolve. Lewis nimbly picked his way through the wreckage, following the intuition that told him the way to the very room where the girl might be. Fear took a back seat to the unbridled desire to find her alive, to help her and bring her back to safety. The fire that raged inside him was stronger than even the elements that were eating away at the building. Every step Lewis took was filled with a fearlessness born of years of work and the realization that his life did not belong to him alone. For a moment, he remembered the words he had once been told: "Firefighting is not a profession, it's a duty." And in that moment, he felt that it was not just a duty, but the meaning of his life. Lewis waded through the darkness, each step draining him of strength. The sounds of fire, hissing and crackling, mixed with the acrid smell of burning, filled the space. He could feel every drop of sweat running down his back, turning to ice cold under the influence of fear. But within him burned a flame of determination. Moving forward, he gathered all his thoughts into a feast, driven by one goal: to save the girl. Through the dense puffs of smoke, he could make out screams. It wasn't just sounds, it was a frantic, terror-filled muttering that made his heart sink. "Help! Please help!" pierced his ears with hysterical shrieks. Each one sounded like a bell calling him to action. They were the cries of a frightened little girl trapped in this fiery hell. Lewis headed toward the sound, his instincts working at full speed. His adrenaline was surging inside him, and he could feel every cell in his body responding to the call. Suddenly, scrambling through the blazing corridor, he came upon an open door. Behind it was a room where fear and despair mingled in the air. And there she was, the girl, her blonde hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, and her eyes, full of tears and terror, searched for hope. She sat her day on the floor, surrounded by fire and smoke that slowly filled the room. Panic was in the air, and each breath she took became more labored. "Don't leave me!" she screamed, her voice breaking with fear, as if she could sense impending doom. Lewis felt his heart break with pain at the sight of this frightened creature waiting to be rescued. He leaned over to her, bending down to see better and make sure everything was going to be okay. "I'm here. I'll save you," he uttered, trying to speak calmly despite the noise around him. He knew that every second counted. Grabbing the girl in his arms, he lifted her gently, trying to hug her in a way that would protect her from the fire. She was light, but her fear filled him with a strong sense of responsibility. Lewis, standing on the edge of hell, felt that he himself had no right to be afraid. He wasn't just saving the girl, it was her only hope. And in that moment, as Lewis turned and rushed for the exit, the girl hugged him tighter, as if she realized that he was the one who could lead her out of this terrible nightmare. "Thank you," she whispered, and the word became his strength, propelling him forward through the fiery canvas that was trying to stop them. When Lewis, holding the frightened girl in his arms, escaped the fiery inferno and stepped into the street, he was stunned by the contrast: the cold air and the bright light of the street lamps, abruptly replaced by the infernal heat and semi-darkness. He frowned for a moment to make sure they were really out, and then the world around him exploded with emotion. The people gathered in the street, who had previously looked at the building with horror and dismay, suddenly came to life. The first shouts of joy pierced the air, and soon the crowd was pouring down a torrent of admiration. "A hero!" they shouted. "You have done well." People rushed toward him, some brushing away tears, others clapping their hands, creating an atmosphere of unity and gratitude. Every look, every smile, every raised fist became an expression of recognition. His feat had not gone unnoticed. The woman with the children in her arms hugged him, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "Thank you, you saved my daughter," she shouted through tears, piercing his heart with warmth and pride. People began to approach, hugging him, shaking his hand as if trying to touch a living legend. Even strangers who had never crossed paths with Lewis before felt the need to express their gratitude to him. Lewis, still holding the girl in his arms, smiled, though the inner tension would not let him go. He was happy, but also exhausted. These moments were a living reminder of what he had fought for, of the power of humanity. In that moment, he felt like not just a firefighter, but a true hero. The crowd sings his praises, and he feels every note penetrating his soul, as if to emphasize that his efforts were not in vain. However, as often happens in life, this moment of triumph did not last long. From that joyous moment, as the sounds of admiration filled the streets, suddenly there was a sharp sound of a siren. The police were approaching. The mood in the crowd changed dramatically. Joy and gratitude were replaced by confusion and bewilderment. People began to whisper, realizing that the shadow of an impending crisis was about to overshadow this bright moment. Lewis felt anxiety creeping back into the atmosphere, filling it with invisible shadows. When the police arrived on the scene, it was as if the joy in the air was momentarily flouncing. The sirens, shrill and harsh, overpowered the shouts of gratitude that had filled the street a few moments before. People began to disperse, startled by the approach of the representatives of the law, who did not seem to share the general jubilation. On the contrary, their faces were serious and wary. Lewis, still holding the girl in his arms, felt his joy begin to fade, as if a shadow had fallen over his soul. The policemen stepped out of their cars, uniformed, their faces stern and their eyes cold, devoid of a spark of humanity. One of them, tall and muscular, approached Lewis, his expression betraying neither respect nor gratitude. "What happened here?" he asked, in a cold tone full of disbelief. The question sounded like an accusation, not an expression of interest in rescue. Lewis felt a chill run down his spine. Instead of congratulating him on his heroism, the policeman gave him a suspicious look, as if his feat had been nothing more than the result of some dubious circumstance. Other policemen began to approach them, also with expressions of bewilderment on their faces. One of them crossed the arms across his chest and said, "We received a report that there was arson here. Why were you inside?" It was as if those words struck a blow to all his accomplishments, sidelining his dedication and fearlessness. Instead of recognizing their real job saving lives, it was as if they were eager to find a reason to question his actions. The crowd, which a moment ago had been admiring Lewis, frowsy, watching the scene with confusion. It was hard to believe that the policemen who were supposed to be his allies were now suspecting him of a crime. Lewis felt his inner calm begin to crack at the seams. He had always known bias existed, but to come face to face with it was excruciating. This moment was not just a physical struggle for him, but a true test of his dignity and courage. He knew they had to remain calm despite the emotions raging inside. Clutching the girl tighter, he tried to raise his head and meet the policeman's gaze, but instead of support and understanding, he saw only doubt and indifference in his eyes. At that moment, Lewis realized that the real struggle was just beginning. The policeman's words hummed in the air like heavy lead. Lewis felt his insides clench, and the tension around him only increased. The policeman, showing no respect for his deed, began to ask questions that felt like an insult, rather than a sincere desire to understand the situation. "Where's your id?" asked the same policeman, whose face remained impassive, even as everything around him was buzzing with excitement. Lewis, taking a deep breath, tried to remain calm despite the growing discontent in his chest. He knew that his rescue was important, but he immediately realized that all his efforts were now devalued. "I'm a fireman. I saved that girl from the fire," he said, trying to put all his determination into the words. But the policeman only raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "That's no reason to be inside a burning building. How can we be sure you didn't set it on fire?" he said with a defiant tone, and the question pierced Lewis like a knife. Feeling the anger rushing out of his chest, he tried to explain, but the words stuck on his tongue. How could he justify himself to these people who were unwilling to see the obvious? Instead of hearing his story, the police officers had already drawn conclusions based on bias and ignored his exploits. In that moment, he felt as if his exploit was just an excuse for humiliation. The other police officers began to ask further questions, their faces impassive. "Why didn't you report the presence of other people inside?" one of them asked, crossing his arms over his chest. How long were you in the building? The other added, as if that information could change what had happened. Lewis felt his fairness began to fade under the onslaught of their unkind questions. Each new question was like splashing cold water in his face. He felt as if he were being interrogated, his humanity ignored, no gratitude, no respect for the fact that he had put his life at risk to save it, only suspicion and distrust. Lewis realized he had to stay strong, but the humiliation of these questions directed at him undermined his confidence. "Tell me, did you consume any alcohol before the call?" the policeman asked, his voice sounding like spittle. At that moment, Lewis felt anger begin to overwhelm him. How could it be that he, at the risk of his life, was in a situation where his valor was being questioned? But there was a feeling inside him that this was not the end. He would not let them humiliate him until they got justice. Lewis stood surrounded by police officers, feeling invisible shackles tightening around him. He knew he had to defend his actions, but how could he explain the obvious when you were faced with people ready to condemn you without even trying to understand? Every one of them seemed set against him, their faces showing no hint of sympathy. "I'm Lewis, firefighter at Station 15, he began, trying to speak calmly, but there was already a hint of tension in his voice. "I got the call of a fire and entered the building to save a girl who was still inside. I risked my life to save her," he blurted out, feeling the storm of emotions building up inside him. Instead of understanding, however, he encountered hostile stares. One of the policemen raised an eyebrow derisively and said, "Do you really think we should believe you? You could have just run away to avoid responsibility." His words pierced Lewis like a poisonous arrow. Each successive question and comment only added to the pressure, as if he were under the harsh light of an interrogation lamp, rather than in an atmosphere where his actions should have been recognized as heroic. Another policeman, with a look of displeasure on his face, interjected, "First you say you want to save her, and then it turns out you were just in the right place at the right time. That's suspicious." Lewis felt the anger boiling up inside him, but he knew he had to stay calm. He couldn't let his emotions take over, but it was harder than ever. "I did save her," he insisted, feeling his words get lost in the hostile environment. "I didn't expect to end up here when I was just trying to help." But there was no response to his words. The police officers looked amongst themselves, clearly not wanting to hear his truth. Every look, every whisper only confirmed his fears. They had already decided that he was guilty, that his deed was just a mask for some dark intentions. Lewis watched the tension in the group grow and felt his own confidence begin to fade. Every question, every disgruntled look exposed not only his vulnerability, but how the system he had once considered his backbone could easily reject him. He fought the urge to scream to make them hear him, to make them realize that he wasn't the enemy, but someone who truly cared about life. "I didn't set that house on fire. I was there when you all stood outside, and now you're blaming me." His voice came out louder, but that only drew more attention. Instead of cheering him on, the police officers began to close in, alienating the crowd that could have stood in his defense. That sense of isolation, the pressure from those who should have been his allies, overshadowed everything he had ever known about justice. The crowd, which a moment ago had been marveling at Lewis's heroism, frenzy in utter shock, misunderstanding and horror overwhelmed the people as the police officers began to approach him with handcuffs. Looking at Lewis, their faces were full of determination, as if they had decided that the only proper outcome to this situation was to apprehend him. It was like the bottom was being ripped out from under his feet, when instead of being recognized for his bravery, he found himself in the middle of a rage. "What are you doing?" shouted a woman from the crowd, her voice sounding shrill and full of despair. She was the very mother whose little girl Lewis had saved, and now she was trying to intervene. Realizing that everything he had fought for was now being questioned, people around them began to rise to Lewis's defense, but their protests only added to the tension in the air. The policemen paid no attention to the outrage of the crowd, their faces remaining impassive. "Stay where you are. Get your hands off me," one of them commanded, looking at Lewis with obvious contempt, as if he were not a savior but a criminal. Lewis felt his heart pounding in his chest, and anger and frustration overwhelmed him. He never thought he would be in this situation, especially after saving a life. When one of the policemen grabbed his shoulder with force and turned him sharply, Lewis realized that resisting would only make matters worse. He tried to explain that his actions were to save a life, but his words were lost in the chaos around him. "Please listen to me. I just saved a child," he shouted, but this only added fuel to the fire. The policeman, paying no attention to his words, pulled on the handcuffs, squeezing them around Lewis's wrist so tightly that it became painful. "You're under arrest for arson and creating a dangerous situation," he pronounced coldly, and at that moment, Lewis felt his dignity being torn apart. A sense of injustice squeezed him inside, as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice, and he lacked the strength to take a step back. The crowd began shouting slogans in defense of Lewis. People voiced outrage, but the police seemed adamant. "Don't touch him, he's a hero," shouted a woman, her voice sounding fierce. Each new shout, however, only emphasized how detached they were from human compassion. As soon as the policeman led Lewis to the patrol car, he felt the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Every step towards the car was full of humiliation. Every look of shock and bitterness from the onlookers tormented his heart. He was a hero who had saved a life, but instead he was now being led away in handcuffs, as if he were guilty of the most heinous crime. Surrounded by police officers, he turned around and met the gazes of the people in the crowd, their faces full of bewilderment and anger. Lewis felt his heart clench with bitterness and loss. He knew this wasn't over. He couldn't let this situation leave a stain on his valor. A flame of determination was already burning in his soul that would fight for justice, no matter what the obstacles. As Lewis, still handcuffed, was pushed toward the patrol car, there was a rumble of discontent all around. The crowd that had earlier cheered in his honor now watched this humiliation with bitterness, but the police seemed completely unprepared to hear their opinions or explanations. Every shout, every word of encouragement uttered in defense of Lewis left them cold and indifferent. Several witnesses tried to intervene, running closer to the police officers and shouting, "He saved a life. He's a hero." But the policemen only cast slanted glances at them, their faces as impassive as if they had been carved out of stone. One of them seemed unable to restrain a chuckle when, crossing his arms over his chest, he said, "If he was a hero, he wouldn't be here." Lewis watched this indifference, and his heart filled with rage. Every word of those policemen felt like a direct blow, as if they were deliberately trying to devalue everything he had done, undermining his exploits for their own gain. He felt his courage begin to fade under the onslaught of their brutality. The woman who had first rushed to his aid, with trembling lips, tried to explain what was happening. "Please listen to me. He entered the building when we were all afraid." But the police officers only shook their heads, as if her words didn't reach their hearts. "This could all be just an excuse," one of them muttered, without interrupting or showing any interest in her story. His words were full of contempt and disrespect. Another witness, an elderly man who had gone through many difficult moments himself, came closer and tried to explain. "I saw him throw himself into the fire. He didn't have to do that. He saved that girl." But even his words, full of sincerity, only elicited a chuckle from the police officers. They did not want to listen. Their minds were closed, and any testimony to Lewis's valor was seen as an attempt to exonerate the criminal. Lewis realized that his sacrifices and courage were being devalued in front of everyone. He witnessed the cruel reality that those who should protect were themselves the cause of fear and humiliation. The indifference of the police officers was particularly painful, as if they had chosen to ignore humanity for the sake of their own authority. It was as if Lewis was in an abyss, and his cries for help were drowned out by indifference. He knew he had to fight for his truth, but how could he do that when the world around him was engulfed in bias and hatred? He felt he had to find the strength to turn that narrative around, to make them see him as a human being instead of a criminal. The flame of hope ignited in his soul again. He vowed that he would not give in and his story would be heard. As Lewis was pushed into the patrol car, he could no longer ignore the animosity that hovered around him. The cops seemed to miss no opportunity to humiliate him, to use his black skin as a weapon against him. With every word they said, Lewis felt his dignity sink to the bottom, leaving behind only bitterness and rage. "You thought you could get away with it," said one of the policemen, looking at him with disdain. "You're going to answer for that now." His voice sounded like he was enjoying his power, and that was just the beginning. Lewis tried to hold on, but a storm of anger was rising inside him. "Heroes don't look like that," the other continued, a sneer in his voice. "Why did you have to get into that fire in the first place? Did you really think you were going to get a medal? Those words were like blows, echoing in his mind each time. Lewis felt tears streaming down his cheeks. Even though he didn't want to show his vulnerability, he couldn't believe that these police officers, who were supposed to be his protectors, were now his oppressors. As if that wasn't enough, the third policeman added, "Maybe you just wanted to show off. If you were a real hero, you wouldn't hide behind a girl." These insults were cutting him up inside. Lewis knew his deed was honorable, but with every word he uttered, his confidence crumbled like sand. He tried to explain that he wanted nothing more than to save a life, but his words were only met with laughter. "How much are you paid to take risks? You're short of money, so you decided to set fire to a building and pretend to be a hero." One of the policemen asked again, and the comment was so vile that Lewis felt a pang of indignation wash over him. Every word they said sounded like a prejudiced accusation, denying all his accomplishments and efforts. Lewis realized that they were deliberately trying to break his spirit. Their insults were not just words, they were an attempt to undermine his personality, to make him insignificant in the eyes of others. It was as if they had chosen him as a target to show their power, and their humiliation was just a reflection of their own fears. When he looked into the eyes of the policeman, he saw not only contempt, but something more, fear of what he might represent. They feared his strength and courage, so they chose humiliation as a way to crush him. Lewis knew he had to stay strong, but every humiliation, every angry comment left deep wounds in his soul. "If you can accept the truth, just admit you're not good enough," one of the policemen summarized, and those words sounded like the final nail in the coffin lid. But inside Lewis, a new resolve was brewing. He knew that these humiliations did not define him, that he was not the only one who would fight for justice. A flame was lit in his heart again. He would fight not only for himself, but for those who had been wrongfully convicted. Lewis was shoved into the patrol car, where he sat in the hard seat. Staring out the window, his hands still felt the steel coldness of the handcuffs, which left painful marks on his wrists. He couldn't believe that his deed, his desire to save a life, had turned against him. The car moved through the streets, and the noise of the surrounding world seemed distant, as if Lewis was in another reality. He tried to comprehend how the police, instead of recognizing his heroism, had chosen arrest and humiliation. Anger was building up inside him, mixed with a deep sense of helplessness. How could it be that he, who had risked his life for others, now found himself in handcuffs? When they arrived at the station, Lewis was pulled out of the car, passing by his colleagues, who only stared at the scene in bewilderment. He could feel their eyes on him, full of shock and disbelief. It was as if in their eyes he had lost his dignity, had become just another criminal, and had pressed him harder than any physical punishment. In a corridor filled with profanity and shouting, Lewis was led to his cell. He felt fear and uncertainty begin to fill his heart. Each step toward the door, which opened with a heavy thud, felt like a fall into the abyss. He looked around, and his gaze met the faces of the other prisoners, some drunk, others furious, but all looking at him with suspicion. When the cell door slammed shut, Lewis was alone in this cold, damp room with bars on the windows. The walls seemed overwhelmingly close, and the dim light shining through the bars created ominous shadows. Lewis closed his eyes, trying to picture himself at the fire, when adrenaline was forcing him into action. He remembered the girl's screams, her terrified eyes as he carried her outside, and the joy that filled his heart as the crowd began to applaud. But now those memories seemed distant and inaccessible, lost in the shadow of humiliation. Thoughts swirled in his head, creating a tangle of emotions. How did I end up here? He asked himself, while memories of the police officers taunting him continued to haunt him. Every chuckle, every insult sounded in his ears as if they were right here beside him. Do I really have to put up with this? He asked himself again and again, feeling his hope for justice begin to fade. Lewis knew he had a right to a defense, but the thought that his words might be ignored or disregarded terrified him. He imagined a trial where his deed would not be recognized, but instead he would be exposed as a villain who had lost control. He felt that everything he had fought for could now be turned against him, and this fear became almost unbearable. At that moment, he remembered the girl he had saved. He couldn't let himself give up. I did it for her, he repeated to himself like a mantra. It gave him strength, allowed him not to give up hope. He thought of her coming home, hugging her mother, living life to the fullest, and it was only because of him. Lewis stood up and walked over to the bars. staring into the darkness as if searching for an answer. "I must fight," he whispered, assuring himself that this was not the end. He began to realize that his fight was not only for his own vindication, but for all those who had ever faced bias and injustice. The flame of determination ignited in his heart. Again, he would find a way to change the situation and let them think of him as a criminal. He knew he was a hero at heart. Sitting on the hard bench, Lewis sank into his thoughts, unable to shake off the overwhelming sense of hopelessness. With every beat of his heart, he realized that he could not let this humiliation break his spirit. There was silence all around him, but within him there were sounds of anger and determination. Every moment spent in this cell was a lesson to him. He couldn't just sit and wait for someone else to say he was innocent. He had to fight for his name. "I'm not a criminal," he repeated firmly to himself, as if it were a spell that could banish all doubts and fears. Lewis realized that his story was not just a personal tragedy. He was part of a bigger picture, a struggle against the prejudice and racism he knew existed in society. He couldn't stay in the shadows when it came to justice. He had to be a voice for those who didn't have the opportunity to speak. "If I give up, what will others say?" he thought, realizing that many black men and women face similar injustices. He recalled his own trials when prejudice impacted his life, his career, and his dreams. These thoughts grew within him, becoming something more, a flame of determination that could not be ignored. Every time he thought of the girl he'd saved, the urge to fight flared up in him. He couldn't let her life and his actions be forgotten. "She deserves to know that I did my best," he whispered to himself. That inner voice became his only comfort when darkness reigned around him. Lewis realized that his struggle must go beyond the confines of this cell. He began to imagine how he would plead in court, how he would tell his story, how he would hold his head up in front of judges and lawyers who didn't believe he was innocent. "I will tell them the truth. I'm not going to let myself be led astray," he firmly decided. He closed his eyes and began to visualize his release, how he would go free, how the fire in his heart would burn even brighter. At that moment, he realized that even in his broken state, he had power. His silent protest became his weapon. He would not speak until he was ready. Instead, he would act, use his courage and determination to demonstrate that he was not just a black firefighter, but a symbol of the fight for justice. "I'm going to get out of here, and I'm going to fight," he said aloud, filling the room with the echo of his determination. Lewis knew there would be hardships along the way, but he was ready for them. The flame of hope rekindled inside him, and he vowed that he would not give up until he had restored his name and gotten justice. As Lewis sat in his cell, tormented by thoughts of justice, important changes were taking place in the world outside its walls. Soon after his arrest, several eyewitnesses who had witnessed his heroics began to realize that what had happened was not just an act of rescue, but a grave injustice that needed attention. These people, moved by justice, decided not to stand by. Among them was Kimberly, a young activist from a local human rights organization. She had seen Lewis risk his life and could not let it go unchecked. Kimberly knew that such incidents were not uncommon. Racism and prejudice were deeply embedded in society, and she couldn't let this story go unnoticed. She began organizing an eyewitness meeting, gathering people willing to support Lewis. They were joined by Jake, a local journalist who was shocked by the news of what had happened. He realized that the story mattered and took the initiative to gather facts and evidence to bring the truth to a wider audience. Jake knew that social media and news could be used to create a big buzz around the incident. His passion for journalism and truth inspired people, and soon several other activists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens joined in. Together they began collecting signatures on a petition demanding an investigation into the incident and Lewis' release. Each of them realized that they were becoming part of something bigger. They created a social media group where they shared information and collected stories of discrimination and bias that people in their city had experienced. Over time, their Shown United movement began to gain momentum. People took to the streets demanding justice. They brought placards with inscriptions, "Justice for Lewis," and "A lifeguard is not a criminal." Crowds began to gather around City Hall, and each day they grew larger. Kimberly, Jake, and their associates organized rallies, speaking on Lewis's behalf, reminding everyone of his courage and that justice must be served. As the news about Lewis became more publicized each day, messages of support began to pop up on social media. People shared their stories of bias, creating a powerful movement calling for change. Lewis' group not only demanded his release, but also raised questions about racism and systemic injustice, forcing society to face a reality it was often unwilling to face. At this time, Lewis, remaining in his cell, felt a power rising behind him that he had never even dreamed of. He couldn't know everything that was happening outside, but every time he looked out the window, he felt that his struggle had not been in vain. He knew that outside this dark room, he had people supporting him, ready to fight for him and for justice, and that thought filled his heart with hope, rekindling the flame of determination in his soul. With every minute Lewis spent in his cell, his story became more and more well known. The case of a black firefighter who saved a white girl and then was arrested quickly gained media attention and went viral on social media. Initial reports of the event appeared on local news, but quickly grew into a massive campaign spanning the country. Journalists like Jake began to investigate the incident in detail, interviewing witnesses, gathering facts, and producing reports full of emotion. They showed how Lewis had shown fearlessness and valor at the risk of his life, and contrasted this with the cruelty and prejudice he faced after his act. Each report emphasized that his arrest was not just a mistake, but a reflection of a deeper problem in society. Social media has also become a powerful tool for spreading the word. Kimberly and her like-minded friends created a hashtag that quickly became popular, Justice for Lewis. People from all over the country began sharing their stories of racism and bias, supporting Lewis and demanding his release. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram were filled with posts where users expressed their outrage over his arrest and demanded justice. Many celebrities, including activists, actors, and athletes, joined the campaign. They shared their views on the situation, emphasizing the importance of combating racism and the need to protect those who show heroism. Each new message of support for Lewis became another brick in the wall of confronting bias. These voices attracted media attention and helped Lewis's story reach more people. Thanks to this public pressure, the authorities were forced to respond. There was talk of an investigation into the incident, and lawyers became involved, ready to help Lewis. Those involved in the arrest began to be criticized, and the public demanded explanations from the police. Each speech in Lewis's defense became a step toward bringing attention to the injustice that affected not only him, but many others. Lewis, in his cell, did not know how much his story had stirred the community, but he could feel the energy building up inside him, as if he had become part of something huge and important. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he had become a symbol around which people were united, ready to speak out against prejudice and racism. Every voice, every word of support that reached his ears filled him with strength and hope. He knew that this struggle was just beginning, and he was ready to fight for justice with others. Lewis realized that his fate now depended on a justice system that was mostly alien to him. Sitting in his cell, he knew he had to take the initiative and fight for his innocence. The first steps in this legal struggle were full of fear and uncertainty, but he was willing to do anything for justice. Once his case was in the hands of a lawyer, Lewis felt he had some hope. The lawyer was an experienced lawyer who specialized in racial discrimination cases and understood how important this case was. He immediately set about gathering evidence, beginning by calling witnesses who could corroborate Lewis's actions on that fateful day. Their testimony was key to building a case for his innocence. The first court sessions were tense. Lewis Saturday in the dock, and every time the doors to the courtroom opened, his heart sank. He knew that on the other side of the table were the prosecutors who were determined to show him as a criminal, not a hero. Every time the prosecutor said his name, Lewis felt the pain and humiliation roll over him again. He couldn't let this become his legacy. At that first hearing, Lewis's attorney outlined his position, explaining that he was not a criminal, but a lifeguard who had acted in good faith. He demanded that the court consider eyewitness testimony and cited examples of racial bias that Lewis had encountered throughout his career. However, the prosecutor, unwilling to back down, began to ratchet up the atmosphere, portraying Lewis as a dangerous man who allegedly had malicious intentions. With each questioning of witnesses, the atmosphere became more and more heated. They were wanting heartfelt words of encouragement for Lewis, but each was followed by questions from the prosecutor that turned the room against him. Lewis, feeling the pressure, tried to remain calm and stay focused. He knew that his fight was not only a fight for himself, but for everyone who has ever faced racism and bias. By the end of the first month of the trial, it was clear that the case was not a simple one. Lewis began to realize that it would take more effort than he had anticipated to get justice. He and his attorney began strategically planning how to turn the situation in his favor. Together, they decided to bring the public into the case by organizing press conferences and allowing reporters to cover his story. Each new court session drew more and more people, and as public support grew, the pressure on the authorities increased. Lewis realized that his court fight was not just a personal challenge, but a real battle for everyone's right to be heard. He decided that he would use this platform to not only defend himself, but also to shed light on the problem of racial discrimination that exists in society. With every minute of the trial to strengthen his resolve, Lewis realized that his name had become a symbol, and he could not afford to give up. Instead, he would fight to the end to restore his reputation and show that true justice is possible, even when it seems that everyone is against you. The trial was a true test for Lewis, where he faced not only prosecutors but also a system that seemed insurmountable. Despite growing public support, he quickly realized that the roots of bias went much deeper than he had anticipated. Every step forward turned into a battle with bureaucracy, systemic barriers, and police resistance. One of the first major obstacles was the lack of documentation to support his actions on the day of the fire. The police, instead of cooperating, tried to cover up their mistakes. Their reports made no mention of Lewis's brave act, and defense counsel found that much of the evidence had been distorted or not properly documented. This created an impressive obstacle to Lewis's acquittal, and his defense faced persistent attempts by law enforcement to dissuade the public from coming forward to defend him. Each new session became an ordeal as Lewis's lawyer tried to find out whether police ignored witness testimony and glossed over key facts. They ran into walls of silence and resistance. The police seemed uninterested in uncovering the truth. Rather, they were trying to save face by eliminating the threat. Lewis posed as a symbol of the struggle against racism. Lewis also faced discriminatory attitudes from some members of the judiciary. Sometimes he felt that judges and prosecutors were prejudiced against him simply because of his skin color. These observations undermined his confidence and questioned his own strength. There were occasional jokes and disparaging comments in the sessions that indicated that Lewis was not trusted, despite his fearlessness and valor. These problems culminated when Lewis and his attorney discovered that some key witnesses were intimidated and refused to testify. These threats were coming from anonymous sources, and no one wanted to risk their well-being by becoming part of a case that had already attracted so much attention. Each new piece of intimidation added to Lewis's sense of loneliness and despair. Despite this, Lewis was not about to give up. He realized that his struggle was not only his own destiny, but also the destiny of many who suffer from systemic injustice. He began participating in local meetings and initiatives, organizing support among survivors. Each time he faced difficulties, he found strength in his like-minded people. Lewis knew that if he wanted justice, he had to do everything he could to overcome these obstacles. He and his attorney began gathering all the evidence they could, contacting experts, and strategizing to show the court that Lewis was not just a hero, but a victim of a system that needed to be fixed. Each difficulty he faced only strengthened his resolve and desire to make a difference, reminding him of the importance of his fight. As Lewis and his lawyer continued their fight for justice, the situation became even more confusing and disturbing. The police, not wanting to look bad and facing public pressure, decided to use tactics that would divert attention from their own mistakes. Falsified evidence began to appear in court that called into question not only Lewis's actions but also his character. At a court hearing, a prosecutor presented documents that allegedly showed Lewis had a history of conflicts with the law. These allegations were issued as part of a board of shame, a list of alleged offenses that had been compiled without proper investigation. However, Lewis' attorney was quick to point out that many of these allegations had nothing to do with reality, and some were completely made up. Police also used anonymous testimony that claimed Lewis had allegedly threatened other firefighters and was a dangerous person. These testimonies were taken from unsubstantiated sources, and none of them were true. In doing so, prosecutors sought to portray the testimony as believable and credible, which caused outrage among Lewis's support in the courtroom. Equally disturbing was when several eyewitnesses who were prepared to testify in Lewis's defense suddenly began to recant. One woman who had been standing near the burning building and had seen Lewis risk his life was subpoenaed, but at the last minute, she said she did not want to participate in the trial. Rumors of intimidation began to spread, and many people began to question whether it was worth risking their safety to support Lewis. Lewis's attorney realized that these fabrications and threats called their strategy into question. He took it upon himself to gather his own evidence to refute the false accusations. He began researching information about the police officers who were responsible for Lewis' arrest and soon discovered that some of them had histories of using excessive force and abusing authority. The lawyer also invited independent experts to analyze the events of the day. They examined the surveillance videos that recorded Lewis's actions and provided convincing evidence of his heroism. These materials confirmed that not only did he not threaten anyone, but, on the contrary, he showed exceptional courage in risking his own life to save the girl. With each new court hearing, Lewis and his lawyer made steady progress, refusing to give up in the face of fabrications and lies. They knew that every false attempt by the police to harm the case only served to increase public resentment, and even as new obstacles appeared in their struggle, Lewis remained determined to prove his innocence and restore his honor, knowing that his story had become a symbol of standing up to a system that should not go unpunished. With each new court hearing, where Lewis faced false accusations and systemic obstacles, public support for his case grew. The story of a black firefighter who showed courage and risked his life to save a girl began to resonate in the hearts of people, not only in his hometown, but beyond. The situation demanded action, and people began to unite to fight injustice. At first, small groups of activists began gathering outside the courthouse, holding signs that read "Savior, not criminal," and "Justice for Lewis." These small protests quickly grew in size as social media and news outlets began covering the events taking place at the courthouse. People shared their support and expressed their displeasure with the actions of the police and prosecutors, not wanting to be left out. As the buzz around the Lewis case grew, protest organizers began planning larger rallies. They brought together people from all walks of life, from students to senior citizens, from workers to families, who recognized that this was not just one person's case, but an issue affecting the entire nation. The first large rallies were held in parks and central squares, where people gathered to share their stories of racial discrimination and prejudice. At these rallies, people made speeches calling for a review of the Lewis case and demanding answers to important questions from the authorities. These speeches were full of emotion, the voices of those who suffered from bias and knew what real hardship meant. Each speaker added his or her voice to a common chorus that loudly proclaimed the need for change. Organizers also used social media to inform more people about their rallies and raise travel funds for those who wanted to participate. The hashtag Justice for Lewis went viral and support grew every day. People not only came to the rallies, but also shared videos and photos, creating a powerful effect of excitement in the community. At one of the rallies, held in the central square, thousands of people gathered. They carried banners with inscriptions such as "We are all for Lewis" and "Justice has no color." Emotions overflowed the air, and the solidarity among those gathered only seemed to grow stronger. Each speaker elicited applause and shouts of support, emphasizing that Lewis' struggle is the struggle of everyone who has ever faced bias. This growing support did not go unnoticed. The authorities began to realize that the Lewis case had gone beyond one man, and that public opinion was beginning to influence the course of events. Protests and rallies led to the authorities beginning to reconsider their actions, and reports began to reach the press that the case might be reviewed. While in prison, Lewis learned about the extent of public support through his lawyer and letters from friends. Each new report of the protests gave him hope and confidence. He realized that he was not alone in this struggle, and that gave him strength. Each statement Each word of support made him more determined to prove his innocence and restore his honor, and he knew that this struggle must continue until justice is served. Despite the growing support and mass rallies, Lewis could not shake the feelings of despair and insecurity that gripped him within the prison walls. Each new day seemed to be a struggle with his own demons, which whispered to him that justice might never be served. These moments were especially hard when he thought about how his life had changed dramatically in a matter of hours. He often thought back to the day he had thrown himself into the flames, risking his life to save the girl, comparing that bravery to the current reality. He felt something dark growing inside him, fear that his valor would not be appreciated, that his name would be forever tarnished by false accusations. He thought about how hard it would be to find a job when this was all over, and how his reputation would be ruined forever. Every time he heard the guards' footsteps, his heart sank, afraid that he would be charged again, or that they would try to humiliate him again. He hid his emotions, trying not to show weakness. He could hear the other prisoners whispering, and sometimes his name was said with derision. These derogatory comments only undermined his self-confidence. He felt his human dignity slowly eroding under the pressure of insecurity and fear. At times like this, Lewis wondered if he was really capable of handling this situation. He knew his support outside was growing, but how would that help him in this ominous place? The walls of the cell seemed to him like a castle from which there was no way out. Each new day repeated in the same vein: routine checks, lack of freedom, and a constant feeling of isolation from the world. It depressed his soul. But most painful for Lewis was the feeling that he had been victimized by a system that was supposed to protect him and provide justice. He felt that his own justice had turned against him, and this thought only increased his fear. He had many unanswered questions. Why did this happen to me? What if I'm never exonerated? Despite these dark thoughts, there was still a spark of hope in Lewis. Every time he thought of the support from the public and those who came out to the rallies, his heart was filled with warmth. He realized that at least one person believed in him and his actions. These thoughts helped him confront his fears, and he knew he had to keep fighting for his honor and justice. But even that couldn't completely supplant the moments when despair overwhelmed him. He felt his strength draining away as each new day brought new challenges. Lewis knew he had to find a way to deal with his fear and regain his inner courage. But in those difficult moments, he only hoped that his struggle would soon bear fruit. After many moments of despair and uncertainty, Lewis finally began to realize that he was not alone in his struggle. The support of lawyers and activists inspired him and gave him back his sense of strength. His time in prison was full of challenges, but it was also a time when Lewis was able to rethink his priorities and focus on his goal. The legal team of experienced lawyers was determined to fight for his innocence. They met with him in prison, discussing defense strategy and gathering evidence that could refute the police's false accusations. Lewis felt their energy and confidence energize him with hope. Each visit was a reminder to him that he had to keep fighting to prove his case. The activists who gathered around his case also became a powerful source of support. They organized legal seminars and created fundraising campaigns to help defray the costs of litigation. Lewis was shocked by how far they were willing to go to help him. These people, of different ages and backgrounds, came together for a common goal of fighting racism and fighting for justice. Their dedication inspired him and lifted his spirit. With each new court session, Lewis became more determined. He became more involved in discussions with his attorney, offering ideas and strategies on how to circumvent the bureaucratic hurdles they faced. Together, they began to develop a plan that included bringing in new witnesses, gathering additional evidence, and getting media coverage of their case to attract the attention of the general public. Lewis realized that with each new step, they were creating pressure on the authorities. He could feel his resolve growing, and each new day in prison was a test not only of his physical endurance, but also of his mental toughness. He knew that if he gave up, it would mean defeat not only for him, but for everyone who believed in him. As second breath lit up inside him, Lewis began to train himself to stay physically active even in these conditions. He devised his own workouts in the confined space of the cell to keep himself physically fit and mentally healthy. Every morning, he would start with deep breaths and visualize his success, imagining getting up on the podium and speaking about his innocence, his struggle, and how that struggle mattered not only to him but to the entire country. Every time his case was mentioned in the news, he felt his public support continue to grow. Lewis realized that their fight had become part of something bigger. He was determined to continue this fight to the end, knowing that his story was not only about personal innocence, but also about the importance of fighting against the systemic racism and bias that continues to permeate society. With renewed determination, he decided that his story would be told, and he would not stop until he saw justice served. Lewis knew it wouldn't be an easy road, but now he felt ready for anything. With the support he had renewed faith in himself and his ability to change the world. The day of the trial had arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was felt more keenly than ever. Lewis, dressed in a simple but neat suit, Saturday waiting. He could feel his heart pounding, and despite the confidence he had been given by his lawyers and public support, fear and uncertainty still troubled him. He knew that this case would be a pivotal moment in his life, a chance to rebuild his reputation and prove his innocence. The courtroom was full. People supporting Lewis occupied every available seat. These faces, familiar and unfamiliar, gave him confidence, but at the same time increased the pressure. In the very center of the room was the judge, who was watching the proceedings closely. What was important at this point was not only what was being said, but also how it was presented. When Lewis's attorneys began their argument, the atmosphere of the room instantly changed. The lead attorney spoke first, stating the facts of the case with confidence and clarity. He presented the new evidence. They had gathered witness statements that refuted the police's claims that Lewis was a threat. The lawyer talked about how he had risked his life to save the girl, and how instead of gratitude, he had been arrested and humiliated. This was followed by testimonies from those who were at the scene. The witnesses described their impressions of the moment of rescue, emphasizing Lewis's heroism and selflessness. These testimonies, full of sincerity, were an important turning point for the entire trial. The public in attendance was moved and supportive of Lewis, listening to every word as if it were their own. But the most important moment was a presentation by an attorney about systemic discrimination. He spoke about the bias and racism that black males face in their community. He presented statistics on how black citizens are more likely to be victims of police abuse and how societal stereotypes affect the perceptions and actions of law enforcement. These arguments, supported by documentary evidence, were key to the development of the case. Lewis's lawyers were not just trying to exonerate him. They were fighting for justice and for the restoration of his honor. Their rhetoric provoked an emotional response, and the hall was filled with a roar of support. As Lewis looked at his lawyers, he felt the fire of hope ignite in his chest. He realized that their efforts not only challenged his case, but also called into question the entire machinery of justice that he hoped would serve as a defense for everyone. The trial was not just a fight for his freedom, but a milestone in their community. Lewis felt that their case could be a catalyst for change. He looked forward to his attorneys, who not only represented him, but also fought a real fight for justice in a world where racism and bias still had a big impact. The turning point came when the lawyer asked the judge whether the justice system could still be fair if it allowed such humiliation and bias. The hall frowned in anticipation, and all eyes turned to the judge, who seemed gripped by tension. Lewis realized that this was not just a question, but a call to action, a call for justice. When the time came for the witnesses to testify, there was a silence in the courtroom, full of expectation. Every eye was fixed on the door, and everyone realized that this testimony could be the decisive moment in Lewis's case. His Saturday in the dock, his heart pounding, and he hoped that these men who had witnessed his deed might shed light on the truth. The first to take the podium was a young woman named Emily, who had been one of the eyewitnesses to the tragedy. Her voice was a little shaky, but she quickly gathered her thoughts. "I was outside when the fire started," she began. "I saw Lewis rush inside. I was amazed at his courage. He wasn't thinking of himself. He just rushed into the fire to save that girl." Emily went on to describe how Lewis, overcome by flames and smoke, found the girl who was screaming for help. She described how he scooped her up in his arms, oblivious to the dangers around him. The tears in Emily's eyes only emphasized her sincerity. "He's a hero," she pronounced with conviction. "No one should have arrested him. He saved a life." The next witness was an older man named George, who was also nearby. He stepped to the podium with a look of determination on his face. I was shocked when I saw what was happening," he began. "But when I saw Lewis carry the little girl out, my heart overflowed with pride. It was a true act of courage. I've been in the fire service myself for many years, and I can tell you I've never seen such bravery." George remembered trying to urge the others to call for help, but when Lewis showed up, he knew he'd be okay. He's a real hero, and instead of being thanked, he's being detained. "It's just a disgrace," he said, looking at the judge with hatred for what had happened. Then another witness, the mother of the rescued girl, came to the podium. She was in tears, but her voice was full of gratitude. "I can never express how grateful I am to Lewis," she said, holding onto the table. "I thought I was going to lose my daughter, and it's only because of him that she's here with us now. I was shocked to hear he was arrested. It's not right." The testimony of these witnesses impressed everyone in the room. Each of them confirmed not only Lewis's bravery, but also his nobility, showing that his actions were not just a spontaneous act, but a true display of courage. The words of these men overrode the police accusations, and the hall filled with a tense atmosphere as everyone stood up for Lewis. Lewis' attorneys used this testimony to show that the public would recognize his deed, not his arrest. They emphasized what really happened that day, emphasizing that Lewis was the victim of bias and ignorant perception, that his actions were noble and selfless. With each new testimony, Lewis felt his confidence grow. These people who witnessed his feat were his voice, and he knew that their support would be the key to bringing justice. In that moment, he realized that their fight was not just about him, but about showing everyone that good still has power and that true heroes don't have to suffer injustice. On the day the court announced its decision, there was an atmosphere of tension and anticipation in the courtroom. Lewis Saturday in the dock, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that this moment would determine his future and his place in society. The supportive community gathered in the courtroom and waited with bated breath for the judge to enter the room and deliver his verdict. That judge, an older man with a wise face and a serious expression, entered the hall and Saturday down in his seat. Everyone stood up, and the hall filled with a buzz as he asked if the parties were ready to announce the decision. Lewis felt every eye fixed on him, and in that moment he was full of hope, but also of anxiety. After a long wait, the judge finally spoke. His voice was firm and confident. He began by summarizing the case, recalling what had happened on that fateful day when Lewis had risked his life to save the girl. The judge emphasized the importance of the words of the witnesses, who testified to Lewis's courage and selflessness. The court concludes, he pronounced, breaking the silence, that the charges against Lewis are not only unfounded, but contrary to the facts. He acted in good faith, and his actions must be recognized as heroic. The words pierced the air, and there was a quiet sigh of relief in the hall. Lewis felt the fire of hope flare up inside him. The judge continued, "The justice system must serve to protect all citizens regardless of their race, color, or social status. Lewis not only deserves his freedom, he deserves to have his name restored." The hall was filled with applause and shouts of joy. The people supporting Lewis hugged each other, tears of joy streaming down their cheeks. It was a moment of triumph, a moment when justice had been served. Lewis felt his heart overflow with emotion. He closed his eyes and tears of joy flowed down his cheeks. He thought about his family, about those who believed in him, and about how hard it had been for him to go through all this. The judge finished his statement, and at that moment Lewis no longer felt like a victim. He was ready to begin a new chapter of his life, a chapter in which his name would be associated not with shame and humiliation, but with heroism and valor. He realized that this decision was not just about him, but about everyone who had ever faced bias and injustice. After the decision was announced, Lewis left the courtroom, surrounded by his supportive friends and activists. They climbed the steps of the building, and there were cameras and reporters waiting to capture this historic moment. Lewis raised his hands in greeting to the crowd, and a sense of pride grew in his heart. He became a symbol of the fight against racism, and his story inspired many. Justice had been served, and Lewis knew that this was only the beginning. He promised himself that he would continue his fight for justice, helping others who face similar trials and giving a voice to those who were disenfranchised. This was his way to redemption and to restore not only his name, but the hope for a better future for all. From the moment the judgment was announced, Lewis's life changed forever. His name became synonymous with justice and courage. People began to gather at rallies in his support, carrying placards that read "Lewis is a hero" and "Justice for all." Lewis soon realized that his story had touched the hearts of many, and he became an important symbol in the fight against racism and prejudice. Through the lens of his ordeal, society began to realize how deeply rooted stereotypes and biases are, and how they can destroy innocent lives. Lewis received invitations to speak at various forums, community events and conferences, where he shared his experiences and called for change. Each time he raised his voice, he expressed hope for a better future in which everyone is afforded the right to respect and justice, regardless of color. In meetings with young people, he spoke about the importance of courage and the willingness to stand up for the truth. Even when it is difficult, his words inspired young people to take steps to make change in their communities, fight bias, and help those who suffer injustice. Lewis realized that his story could be a motivation for many, and he was determined to use that power for good. Lewis also began working with organizations that fight racism, teaching people to recognize and confront the bias in their lives. He actively participated in events to raise awareness about racial issues, and his image as a hero became important in creating a dialogue about changes in society. One day, after one of these events, Lewis saw a small group of people standing next to his image on a banner. They were discussing how his story had inspired them to fight for their justice. In that moment, he realized that his struggle was not just about him, but about others who faced similar trials. He became a symbol of hope, and his story reminded people that even in the darkest of times, light and support can be found. Lewis continued his work and his influence grew. He became part of important discussions at the government level, advocating reforms to prevent police brutality and racial discrimination. His name was now a sign of the fight for equality and justice, and he felt that every day he was moving closer to a world where everyone would be judged by their actions, not their race. In the end, Lewis realized that his trials led to greater understanding and unity in the community. He became a symbol of victory over prejudice and proof that courage, valor, and determination can change destinies. Hope and aspiration for a better future are associated with his name, and Lewis was committed to continuing his mission of inspiring people to stand up for justice and equality for all. Dear viewers, we would like to hear your opinion about this story. What do you think about Lewis's fight for justice? Have you experienced racism in your life? Your thoughts and experiences are very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. We are sincerely grateful for your support and participation. We wish you a good day.